Once we have columns with height and width, one of the things we want to experiment with is beginning to actually put other columns next to each other. And this is really the power of the div, where we can begin to start creating multiple dynamic pages that can actually reflow depending on the size of the browser. And technique we're going to use is a technique called float. And what float does is it's very simple. We're going to add it onto the left and right column, and then we're going to actually fix it because I'm going to do something that's going to break everything. And why that's important is because there's actually a way to solve it. So I'm going to get my columns to be 200% or 200 pixels. I'm actually going to do that onto my right column as well. So now I have two columns next to each other. I'm going to reload. Of course, I want them to reflow. And this is where I'm going to use float left. Again, float's there. I type in float left. I reload the page. And you notice that all my columns kind of just squish on top of each other. And one of the things about float is, remember, cascading style sheets. As soon as I add one piece of code to another, it's going to affect another piece of code down the line. So here's where I can actually begin to look at it and say, well, what if I wanted to float one column right after the next column? So I'm going to want to apply float left onto the right-hand column as well. Maybe I won't call it the right column, maybe I should call it the second column. And now I have the right column is squishing next to the left column. But oh no, what happened? I broke something again. Now the footer text is actually stuck like a column. I didn't want that. I wanted to be a footer text that actually goes across the whole thing. So the first thing what we'll do before we fix that is I'm going to show you how right works, which is really, really powerful as well. You notice again, if you notice that when I resize the screen, the column actually reflows to the bottom, and then because I'm using float left, it sticks the footer column right into the left-hand side again. So it's kind of really pushing, float left pushes everything to the left-hand side and everything inside of it. So one of the things I might do is, for fun, I'm going to show you guys float right. I'm going to show you guys float right again, and we're going to reload the page, and now everything is floated to the right, including my left column, my right, and my footer. But you're going to tell me, Adrian, how did that happen? And remember, if everything's floating to the right, the HTML is going from column to column to column. So it's going left column first to the right-hand column to the right, and then the footer column to the right. Not the most fanciest of effects, but why don't we go back and use the left column? And why don't we actually go in and fix the footer column? So one of the things in order to stop the CSS madness here and stop the floating from left to right in the cascading down is in the footer, we're actually going to add the variable called clear. And clear, you can actually want to tell it to clear the actual attribute that's happening. You would want to use left, or you'd want to use right to clear the float left or float right. I actually like to, hit a boulder with the whole thing and just say, you know what, I'm going to use both. And it says get rid of everything. So now that any attribute, because you never know, I might put a right in there, I might put a left in there, I can now clear it. One of the great things about this is, let's say I wanted to float the left-hand column here and the right-hand column here, because remember, I'm using both. I'm telling clear to get rid of any of those attributes that I find. Now I can have a real right column that actually squishes to the right. And if you think about it, it actually might start looking like a real page. It's not really reflowing correctly, and that's because I don't have a center column. I might want to do that in terms of having a content area, because right now, this is just a wasted space. But what I like to do, and a technique that I like to work on, is using left. Let's reload the page, and let's actually build columns that are usable. So I'm going to actually come into the left-hand column. I might actually use a little bit of CSS override, and we'll talk about this in a more complex technique in the next chapter. But I'm going to actually tell two things, a left column and the right column, to have some of the same attributes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say right column, comma, left column, comma, and then add my brackets. This syntax says I want this CSS syntax to affect both the right column and the left column. And you notice that it's at the end. And again, remember, the CSS, like HTML, is loading from top to the bottom, so I'm inherently writing an override. And the override is going to say, by the way, I want you to add a little bit of margin around all the columns. I'm going to say margin, I'm going to say 20 pixels, I'm going to hit reload, and now I have a margin around everything. And so this is pretty cool because now I actually have two columns floating in the background. Kind of interesting, but if I really wanted to fancy them up, what I could do is I could add corner radiuses. I can actually maybe put them together. If I decide I want 20 pixels against 20 pixels, what I might do is actually only keep the left column here, so that of course I'm still playing, so I might actually maybe even get rid of this, move the margin of 20 around the left hand column, reload the page. Of course this one sticks up because we now see the full margin, and I can actually come in and say margin left on the right hand column is 0 pixels. Again, it's already 0 right now. And then the margin top is 20 pixels. Don't forget the O. I reload the page, and now I have a series of columns. I could also have created a class that only thing in that class was just a left-hand margin, and then I've added it into here over and over again. But again, now I've got multiple columns, and the really great thing about this is that they reflow one over the other. So what I would want to be careful is I'd actually want to also add in a right hand on certain accounts. I might even actually add padding on this center area here. What I can also do with divs is I can nest them. So I could put div within a div, like a little Russian doll, put one div within another div within another div. So I might actually even wrap these around a div with padding, and so that when I reflowed the columns, they would stack up against each other. How this is useful, I once worked on a page design where we are loading up little individual modules, one piece of functionality, another piece of functionality, and another piece of functionality, and the developers and engineers looked at me and said, Adrian, well, what if I took one away? What would happen? And so I said, sure. I hid some HTML, and the next box after it slid right in. And they said, how'd you do that? And I said, this is the power of CSS and using floats. Every column that has a float left will slide in if you disappear another column. So there's a lot of power in this, because if I wanted to actually go in and add more columns, they would keep on stacking and stacking and stacking to the left, and even reflow to the bottom and go over and over again. So if you were thinking about making a portal page with little boxes individually, this is the perfect use of it, of using float, using right. And one of the really, really most important things before we wrap up with this section is always remember you're clear. The majority of your problems will happen when you don't have a clear. A lot of times what I'll do in order to remind myself that it's really, really important, I'll actually create, instead of adding clear to the footer, I'll actually create a class called clear. And what I'll do is I'll copy the clear into this class so that it's not just attached to the footer. And what I'll do is I'll add that class into the footer. So if I was really, really interested again, I can also add a class into the ID. Remember, I can only use an ID once, just like my example, but I could use multiple classes over and over again. This is really a good way so that if I want to actually, I reload the page, of course nothing happens because it works. If I want to use that clear code again and actually make sure I'm not typing it over and over again, make sure that I remember that it's there, I now have a class and I can attach to anything else. So if I want to actually duplicate the float left, I could actually add a series of columns underneath here use float left or make them float right, and then add my class to clear. That way it's always there. I remember that it's there. I'm not replicating code over and over again. And the best power of it is, if the first time I do this, I know I'm going to mess up, it's going to be the clear that's going to fix it. So here's my tip from me. I hope this helps.